Hi everyone, welcome back. First video in quite some time as we gear up for the new school year. So in today's video, we are going to talk about one of my favorite things, which is the concept of virginity. And we're going to answer two questions that might not seem related at first, but are very intimately related. So I've been thinking about making this video for quite some time, but needed a little push to do it. And so the first push I got was from this book I'm reading, Linda K. Klein's Pure, which is part memoir, part study of evangelical purity culture, drawing on her time in purity culture and conducting hundreds of interviews of people who were in purity culture and are or are not still affiliated with evangelical Christianity and purity culture. So reading this book had me thinking about this lecture, and then I got a push from a Facebook conversation with a friend. So Joni Martin, if you're watching this one's for you. So the two questions, like I said, are: is virginity real? And why do lessons about virginity within evangelical purity culture, why are they always so related to food? So those might not seem related, but I think I can make a solid case that they are. Before I do that, though, I want to kind of ground this in my own experience in the purity culture. I'm reading this book very slowly because it is reminding me of a lot of not super happy memories from my time in the purity culture, which lasted for over a decade. And that is in the same way that it sparked Klein's work, it sparked my own. As I have said in previous videos, I feel that in some ways I started researching how we talk about virginity when I was in 8th grade. I was 14 years old, and a friend of mine who was a sophomore who was 16 got kicked out of our evangelical private school because she got pregnant. And it actually wasn't that she got pregnant. That wasn't the reason that she was kicked out. It was because being pregnant meant she could not deny that she had been engaging in some form of sexual activity. And that was an offense that merited expulsion in the bylaws of my evangelical Christian school. And I remember talking to the principal at the time saying, of all places, wouldn't we want an unwed teen mother to have a Christian community around her? And the principal said, yes, but not our community. Kind of the evangelical equivalent of not in my backyard. So as I'm reading Pure by Klein, one of the things that I'm really remembering is how brutally dismissive of my friend's experience people were. So let me give her a name. I'll call her Elizabeth. So it was a very small school. My graduating class had 12 people in it, which was a large class for my school. So this was not something that could really be hidden or go unnoticed, that Elizabeth was being expelled, and we very quickly found out why. And I remember a lot of the gossip around Elizabeth's expulsion talking about how she wasn't trustworthy because sometimes when you asked her what had happened, she would say that she had had sex, and other times she would say that she had been sexually assaulted. And this was used as evidence to dismiss her claims. And as I'm rereading Pure and thinking about this 2 decades later, the thing that I can't help coming back to is, how would she have known the difference between engaging in consensual sexual activity and not? Because as Klein illustrates so well in Pure, so much sexual responsibility is put on girls and young women before they can fully understand it. So within evangelical communities, and particularly within evangelical communities that subscribe to and promote purity culture, there is this reference that women are temptation, right? We are told not to be stumbling blocks to our brothers in Christ, not to tempt our brothers, etc. And so just existing as a woman can kind of blur the lines with consent. And further, on top of that, there's a very long history of male Christian thinkers making arguments akin to the fact that if a woman inspires less than a man, that is because there is something about her that is already wrong, that is already lustful. And so in that culture where your body is always seen as a temptation or an invitation, and you have to watch out and you have to be what we would call the sexual gatekeeper, so in charge of deciding when intimate activity starts and stops and how far it gets, it blurs the lines of consent. And so looking back, with a master's and a PhD and 20 years more of life experience on Elizabeth's story, I could see how people, and I should include myself in this because I was not exempt, right? This is the culture we all moved in, were at best confused and at worst discrediting of Elizabeth's narrative because we had no idea what consent was. And in some ways, like Klein talks about, purity culture actively reduces the question of consent. So how does that all tie into today's questions of, is virginity real? And why does purity culture have so many object lessons around sexuality and virginity that have to do with food? So let's tackle that first question. Is virginity real? Yes and no, right? So the no is that there's no medical definition of virginity. There's no medical test someone can perform that can verify that you are or are not a virgin. There is no way that you can look at someone and tell. There's no way that you can, shake someone's hand and know instantly that, they're sexually active in the same way that you could shake someone's hand and know that they haven't used lotion in a while. That doesn't exist. So in that very physical medical sense, virginity is not something that exists. Virginity is a social construct. And when we say that something is a social construct, that doesn't mean that it's not real. That means that it's not fixed. So let me see if I can think of an example. The idea that women wear high heels and men don't is a social construct. So that's a real thing. If you go out into the world, you will notice that most men don't wear high heels. Not all women do, but the vast majority of people who wear high heels are women. And while some men wear high heels, they often identify as drag queens, or they identify as non-binary. And so they are purposefully not identifying in the moment that they are wearing those high heels as men. Most of the time. Of course, there are exceptions. Now, the reason that's a social construct is because that's fluid. High heels were actually invented for men. They were invented for performers of the French ballet to show off the leg muscles. And so it used to be only men could perform in the ballet, and so only men wore high heels. And then, of course, you have a fascinating history of high heels moving through aristocratic courts. But it used to be that men wore high heels far more than women. So it's not that it's a thing that's not real. It's that it's a thing that's not fixed. Another example that I think we're all really familiar with is the speed limit. Now, the speed limit's not a perfect example. I'll tell you in a second. But the speed limit is a thing that, by and large, we mostly agree to do through something called a social contract. And you know this if you have ever gone over or under the speed limit. It is not a physical, immutable law of nature. And if you have ever lived in a place where the speed limit has changed, where it's gone up from 25 to 35 or gone down from 75 to 65, you will realize that that is a thing that we all collectively, more or less, agree to as a society, not an inviolable law of nature. Now, the reason the speed limit is not a perfect example is because the speed limit in most cases is set by experts who determine the safest speed to go on a stretch of road. And that's not really true with virginity. It doesn't exist because it is somehow safer for people to have it exist. So that's what we mean when we say social construct. We mean that it is something we have all agreed to participate in, or to act as if it is real, or to let it limit or guide our behavior. But it absolutely can change. Now, here's where this gets really interesting, because when we say, is virginity real or not, even if we say yes, it's real as a social construct, it is something that we mostly agree exists, then we get into the question, right? Who does it exist for? Why does it exist? It brings up a whole host of questions when we ask, is virginity real? And then we say, well, it exists as a social construct, so it is real in that sense. And so who does virginity exist for? Technically everyone, but overwhelmingly women. Even the word virgin means young or unmarried girl or woman. So if you go back far enough linguistically, that is kind of the root of the word. And you will find as you study these things that it is overwhelmingly applied to bodies that are perceived as female rather than bodies that are perceived or identified as male. So it exists largely to be enacted on women. That doesn't mean it exists for women. Virginity definitely exists not for individual men, but for the structure of the patriarchy. So remembering that the patriarchy is the system in which men as a group have control over women as a group, and some men have control over other men. That's what patriarchy means. It's a way of organizing a society. Virginity exists for the patriarchy. And the reason that virginity exists for the patriarchy is because for most of human history, we did not have Maury Povich, we did not have daytime talk shows, and we did not have paternity tests. And so if you lived in a patriarchal society where wealth and status was passed down from a man to his son, and you wanted to make sure that your wealth and status went to your son and not someone else's, with no kind of way to test that, the easiest, most expeditious way to do that was to impose huge penalties on women who had sex before marriage or had sex with other people, with other men during marriage, thus calling into question the paternity of their children. So that is kind of the functional reason why virginity exists. Now, there are definitely people who would argue on a metaphysical level that virginity is a means of sexual control, because if you wanted to kind of get into like the mystic side of it, and you were talking about male and female energies of creation, that's a whole other conversation that I'm not really qualified for. So if a philosopher or a metaphysicist wants to jump in and talk about that, they can. But I will just sum it up by saying there are people who say that the sexual control of women is about limiting women's power in the world. And they make kind of a metaphysical argument for that. But there's also a physical argument, because when you limit the way that a woman can express her sexuality, when you limit the way anyone can express their sexuality, you limit a lot of things about their life, like where they can go and who they can go there with and what kind of activities they can and can't participate in, etc. So when we talk about, is virginity real, the answer is a very qualified yes. Now, let's get into specifics instead of kind of vague or general definitions of virginity. Often when people say, is virginity real, what they're partly asking, or how they're framing their answer, is, does the experience of having heterosexual penis in vagina sex change who you are as a person? Do you go from a virgin to a whole other category of person, which is the non-virgin? And so the answer to that is a kind of obvious no, right? There is nothing about having sex, however you define sex, but in the context of virginity, it's mostly penis and vagina intercourse. There's nothing about sex that changes you as a person. You are a complete person, always, already. And your relationship to sex, whether that be heterosexual or asexual, that is part of your completeness and wholeness. And there's nothing that someone could do to you, and there's nothing that you could choose to do that would make you anything less than a precious, precious, precious entity deserving of love and respect. Now, some people in the comments might say, some people are not kind, some people hurt others on purpose, etc., etc. Yes, that is a whole separate argument, right? What do we owe people who go through the world choosing to be unkind? But I operate from the school of belief that every person at their core is deserving of love and respect. Now, as I also tell my students, not everyone is called to the work of compassion, right? That means that if someone hurts you, you don't have to go out of your way to empathize with them. You also get to set your own healthy boundaries. But at the end of the day, even if I find that I can't give a person love and respect because they have hurt me too deeply, I still choose to believe that they are worth it. And so you are always worth it. No matter what you've done or what has been done to you, you are always worth love and respect. You are always precious. You are always unique and singular and needed. So that's kind of my sappy inspirational message for the day. My students will know that I always have to have at least one. So here's where we get to where these original two questions connect. When people say, is virginity real? And when they're asking from a framework of, is there something about having penis and vagina sex for the first time that changes you as a person? The clear, logical answer is a no. But there's also a yes, right? Because we are also working in patriarchal systems and patriarchal societies. And even though we no longer need to enforce virginity to ensure paternity, I'm sorry if you can hear that fly buzzing around. He's really interested in this video. Go away. Even though we now don't need virginity to ensure paternity, it has become a foundational part of all patriarchal cultures, which are most cultures in the world today. And so this leads us to the fact that when people teach object lessons about virginity, they often use food as an example. So Klein goes through dozens that her interviewees remember. These are some that I've encountered in my research. So there's the dirty chocolate, which is where you take a chocolate bar and you ask who wants it, and then you pass it around a group of 12 to 30 people, and everyone touches it, and by the end it's kind of like greasy and dirty and gross, and then no one wants it, right? Or you ask if someone wants a drink of water from a water jug, or if they want to drink from a jug that everyone in the classroom has spit in. Or there's a particularly disgusting one with Cheez-Its, where you ask someone if they would like a fresh box of Cheez-Its, but you've also had everyone chew some Cheez-Its and spit them in a container, or you ask if they want the already chewed up Cheez-Its. The pre-chewed thing is something they do with gum. There's a weird lollipop one where the takeaway is no one wants a previously sucked on lollipop. So there are so many examples comparing the person who has sex outside of a married, monogamous, heterosexual relationship to food that is no longer appetizing, or food that no longer has nutritional value, or food that might have a lot of germs or be unsafe to eat. There's a ton of these. And it's hard to know exactly how many there are, or how many are in different curriculum. And the reason for that is because churches and private Christian schools are not regulated by the government, local, state, or federal at all. And they're under no obligation to tell you what, if any, sex ed curriculum they use. And so they don't. So we know that they're the biggest buyers of these curriculum, but we don't know which parts they're using or not using. We don't know who exactly is buying what. Occasionally, schools will purchase these purity curriculum that are overwhelmingly from evangelical publishers. And public schools can do that through block grants provided by the federal government. But even schools, even publicly funded schools, often go through extensive pains to conceal what sex ed curriculum they're using. And if someone takes objection to something in the curriculum that they're using, they'll often just say they're not using that part. They'll say, yeah, that part's bad. We're not using it. We're using everything else. So it is virtually impossible to know where this curriculum, with these examples of kind of the dirty food, are being used. Now, Klein, like I said, interviewed hundreds of people who participated in evangelical purity culture, and she has a whole section dedicated to these kind of food object lessons about purity, and that the person who has had premarital sex is like bad food, right? Dirty food, food that's not safe to eat, that might make you sick, or is just really unappetizing. So why is that? And you're very smart, and so you probably have a couple of answers already, right? Which is that a lot of times our language around sexuality and food is very similar. We talk about appetites. You know, when you're scrolling through TikTok and someone makes a TikTok for the purpose of just being attractive or sexy, we call that a thirst trap, right? So we use a lot of the same words between food and sexuality. You know, we talk about them as basic drivers of human action. We talk about them as biological imperatives. We talk about appetites, and we talk about thirst, and we talk about desire in some of the same ways between food and sexuality. And so there is kind of a natural parallel there. But I don't actually think that's where it comes from. I have been moving in this space a long time. Remember, I spent 20 years of my own lived experience and a little more in purity culture, and I have spent over a decade researching purity culture and the rhetoric of purity culture in particular. And I think that this narrative about food is actually a little more sinister than we give it credit for. Because play the narrative out, right? The object lesson always starts and stops with, we had food that was good, then people partially ate it, and now it's bad, right? But let's follow that through. Like, what if someone didn't partially eat it? You know, what if they had the whole lollipop, or they ate the chocolate bar, they didn't spit out the Cheez-Its? What if they ate the food? What happens to food when it's consumed? Well, right, your body uses the nutrients it can use, kind of beats it up and mashes it up and breaks it down, uses the nutrients that it needs, and then it passes out of your body as waste product, as excrement. And so I think these food analogies, while innocent, I shouldn't say innocent, while at best quirky and at worst disgusting, are uniformly sinister in that when you make an analogy, and these analogies are often very, very heavily coded as the food is a woman. For some reason, the food's never a man. When you make an analogy that a woman is like food, it goes beyond just saying that a woman is like an object, which we see in non-evangelical culture all the time. But what it does is it makes the object that it makes the argument that a woman is an object that exists to be consumed. A woman is the type of object that exists so that her wholeness can be consumed and broken down and used to fuel an individual. And that after that process is over, she's about as useful as a pile of shit. So when we ask, is virginity real? I think one of the important things to do is to look at all of these object lessons surrounding food, because what they tell us is that virginity is very real, not only in the sense that it is something that we are taught, that it is something that doctors act as if it is a medical reality, even though you won't find it in a single medical textbook ever. When we ask, is virginity real? And what we mean is, does having sex change a woman? The answer in a patriarchal culture will always be yes. Because in a patriarchal culture that frames a woman's worth as the sexual value that she has to give to her partner, and in a culture that assumes that you have less value the more partners you have, right? It's kind of the opposite of like lifting weights. It's not like every partner makes you stronger and better and faster something, right? It's not like exercising where every iteration makes you better. It's the opposite, right? It's like pie, where every time you engage in this activity, you have a little less, right? So in a patriarchal culture where a woman's value is her sexuality, and every sexual encounter decreases that value, just like every slice of pie you eat decreases the entirety of the pie. See, look, I tricked myself into using these food object lessons. They're powerful. They burrow into the subconscious. In a patriarchal culture where women are seen as consumable objects, and that the primary thing to consume about a woman is her sexual value, then yes, losing your virginity does change you. Not to yourself, doesn't change your immutable worth, but it will change your status and your value in a patriarchal culture. And for what it's worth, that's not something I'm making up. That's actually something that has been written in laws in different countries over different years. Dr. Bernau, in her book Virgin, A Cultural History, goes into a great discussion of English common law and the penalty for rape of different categories of women. So there was the category of virgin, a young wife that had not yet had a child, and then a mother, right? And so if you raped a virgin, it was considered stealing that woman's value from the man she belonged to, be that her father who was going to marry her off, or the person she was betrothed to. And then if you raped a woman who was sexually active but had not yet had a child, sexually active in the bounds of marriage, you had stolen some of her value, right? You had stolen the security that the child she bore within the next 12 months would be the child of her husband. And then if you raped a woman who had already had several children, who was a mother, it was the lowest category of property crime because she had no value left. She had given it all up. And that was encoded in the law with examples. Dr. Bernau also goes into a great description of how rape was understood differently than we understand it today. It was considered a property crime. A property crime against the person to whom the woman belonged, not the woman herself. So when we say in a patriarchal culture that virginity changes you, it doesn't change you in your own eyes, I hope. And it shouldn't change you at all. But in a patriarchal culture where a woman's worth is what she has to give sexually, it inevitably changes you. And so that's a little sad and that's a little heavy, and I like to end things on an up note. And luckily there's a really good up note here, which is, remember, if we go back to our definition of what a social construct is, a social construct is something that exists but can change. We can change the social construct here, and there are a million easy ways to do it. So in your own life and in the lives that you can influence, be that your children or children you have responsibility for, or with your friends, instead of using the phrase virgin or lost virginity, try using sexual debut. You did a new thing. You debuted a new part of yourself, sexual debut. And that reframes it from being lost, and it gets away from the language of virgin, which has its own deeply patriarchal history in which women are property. Another way to do it is hold your local school accountable. Go to meetings if you can. If you can't, email anyone you can email till you find who buys the curriculum, and ask them what they are teaching for sex ed. Sit in on a sex ed class if you can. If you have children who are going through sex ed, take a peek at their homework. If you don't have children, or the school system is not a good place for you to do your activism, call your state representative. So the person who represents your district to your state legislature. Let them know what you want in sex ed and what you want your state sex ed laws to be like, because we have great data that shows that your representative in your state legislature, they really do change their opinion on issues if just like 5 people call and talk to them. And 5 people is you and a dinner party, a small dinner party. Like, that is something that you can do. They really will take your opinion into account because at the state level, they really need every vote. And because it's assumed that if one person takes the time to call, they represent on average 10 people who feel the same way. So if you and 4 of your friends call, it represents about 50 people who feel the same way that you do. And that's too many people for a state rep to ignore. So if you want to make an influence in sex ed, certainly contact your state representative for your state legislature and let them know what you want, what you don't want them to be spending money on, what you do want them to be spending money on. Contact your federal representative too, because you'll recall I mentioned that a lot of this curriculum is produced by evangelical publishers but is bought with federal money, aka your tax dollars, by public schools. And if you don't like that, call your federal reps and tell them. Call your state rep who represents you in Congress. Call your senators. Tell people. You can certainly donate to a lot of places that are doing very, very good work around this. The Sexuality Education Information Council of the United States, or SECUS, does wonderful jobs keeping track of numbers and lobbying for better sex ed that doesn't have this kind of very toxic purity culture idea that women lose their worth after sex, just like a Cheeto disappears after you eat it. So certainly contact them. I would also work, if you want, you could contact any number of organizations who work with survivors of sexual abuse and sexual assault. If you have the time and the interest, going through a training to work on a sexual abuse or sexual assault hotline would be amazing, because like I said at the very beginning of this video, the way that this sexuality education presents sexuality as something that a woman is kind of always at fault for has led to a lot of women who experienced sex without consent and maybe didn't even realize that they had the option for consent until years or decades later, and they need someone to talk to, and they may need someone to be their advocate. If you are churched, if you have a church home, and you see some of this rhetoric in what they are teaching, ask them to do better, because they can. They absolutely can. There are many wonderful Christian and even evangelical teachers out there who are doing better. I know several personally. I'm very lucky that way. I also went to Christian schools for a long time. But one who is on kind of the national stage is Nadia Bolz. Her book Shameless is absolutely wonderful. In terms of articulating why this idea of purity is not theologically sound. So if you are churched, ask your church to do better. If you are in a community of faith, no matter what your religion is, and you see elements of this, because this is certainly not limited to evangelical Christianity, ask them to do better, because they absolutely can. And if they refuse to do better, consider finding a place that will. I'm not going to tell anyone that they should leave their church, because the emotional and communal support that churches provide is complex. But think about being in a place that prioritizes sexual health and consent as one aspect of God's glorious creation. So yeah, that's the good news about sexual constructs, is that even the most damaging ones can be changed. I'm going to butcher a quote from Ursula Le Guin, which is, anything made by humans can be undone by humans. And so if you don't like this toxic notion of virginity or purity culture, then let's get to work on doing it. Okay, everyone, have a great day.